That night, the Ottoman Empire did not lose a war. There were no cannons firing, no armies retreating, no city falling under enemy flags. But before the ink dried, an empire that had ruled 3 continents for centuries accepted something far more permanent than defeat: debt. This was not the night the Ottoman Empire collapsed. This was the night it admitted it could no longer stand on its own. For centuries, the empire had survived wars, rebellions, invasions, and internal decay. It had lost territories, populations, and prestige, but it had always retained one thing: sovereignty, the ability to decide its own fate. On that night, it surrendered that too. This was the Ottoman Empire's final debt, and this was the night the signature changed everything. The room was quiet. Papers lay neatly arranged on a polished table. Foreign representatives waited calmly, confidently. Ottoman officials sat across from them, exhausted, but composed. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. The outcome had already been decided long before anyone entered the room. Outside, Istanbul continued its nightly rhythm. Boats moved silently across the Bosphorus. Lamps flickered along narrow streets. Life went on, unaware that something fundamental was being signed away. Inside, the empire was being placed under supervision. For generations, the Ottoman state had struggled to keep pace with a changing world. Military reforms came late. Industrialization lagged behind Europe. Trade routes shifted. Revenues declined, but expenses did not. The empire still had to fund armies, administration, infrastructure, and court life. To bridge the gap, the Ottomans borrowed. At first, it seemed manageable. Loans from European banks offered quick relief. They funded reforms, wars, and modernization efforts. The empire believed it was buying time. But time is the most expensive loan of all. Interest accumulated. Conditions tightened. Each new loan paid off an old one, while adding new obligations. What began as temporary assistance became structural dependence. By the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer managing debt. Debt was managing the empire. Revenue streams were mortgaged. Customs income was pledged. Taxes were earmarked before they were even collected. The state's financial autonomy eroded quietly, line by line, clause by clause. Still, the empire resisted full surrender. Pride mattered. Sovereignty mattered. Even as power declined, the Ottomans clung to the belief that control could be regained. Then came the breaking point. Wars accelerated the collapse. The Crimean War, Balkan uprisings, continuous military expenditure drained what little flexibility remained. The empire was fighting to preserve territory while bleeding economically. In 1875, the Ottoman state did the unthinkable. It defaulted. Payments stopped. Confidence collapsed. European creditors panicked. The empire's reputation shattered overnight. The message was clear. The Ottomans could no longer meet their obligations. Default was not just a financial event. It was a political crisis. European powers did not see unpaid debt as a mistake. They saw it as an opportunity. Negotiations followed, pressure mounted, diplomacy hardened. The empire was told it could no longer be trusted to manage its own finances. And so, the night of the signature approached. Ottoman officials understood what was at stake: accept the terms and surrender financial control, refuse and face isolation, intervention, and possibly partition. There was no good choice, only less catastrophic ones. The agreement did not come with gunfire or occupation. It came with clauses, commissions, and oversight. Foreign representatives would monitor revenues. Certain taxes would be collected directly by an external authority. The empire would pay, whether it liked it or not. This was not conquest. It was administration. The Ottoman Empire would continue to exist. The Sultan would remain on the throne. Flags would still fly. Laws would still be issued. But the core of sovereignty had shifted. That night, the empire did not fall. It was placed into receivership. And once that happened, everything else followed. The signature was not dramatic. No hesitation, no defiance, just a steady hand and a resigned understanding that resistance had already failed. When the pen touched the paper, the Ottoman Empire acknowledged what it had avoided for decades. It was no longer financially independent. That night did not end the empire, but it ensured how it would end. After the signature, nothing collapsed overnight. That was the most deceptive part. The Ottoman Empire continued to function. Ministries opened, orders were issued, taxes were collected. The Sultan still ruled in appearance. To the outside world, it looked like stability had been preserved. In reality, the center of gravity had shifted. What the Ottomans had accepted was not simply debt repayment, it was oversight, control, supervision by foreign creditors who no longer trusted the empire to manage its own finances. This new structure had a name: the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. It sounded technical, bureaucratic, harmless, but in practice, it was something unprecedented. A foreign-controlled institution operating inside a sovereign empire, extracting revenue directly at the source. Certain taxes were no longer Ottoman, they were collateral: salt taxes, tobacco revenues, stamp duties, customs income. These streams were removed from imperial control and placed under the authority of the debt administration. The money never passed through Ottoman hands. It flowed straight to creditors. This was not reform. It was foreclosure. The empire had not lost territory in this agreement. It had lost autonomy, the ability to decide how its own resources were used. The Ottoman state could still collect some taxes, but the most reliable and profitable revenues were no longer its own. Inside the empire, the effects were immediate and corrosive. Local officials found themselves bypassed. Foreign administrators enforced collections with efficiency and indifference. Ottoman citizens paid taxes to institutions that did not answer to their government. Authority fractured, loyalty eroded. The empire had become financially transparent to outsiders and opaque to itself. This changed everything. Policy was no longer driven by strategic necessity or domestic priorities. It was constrained by repayment schedules. Military spending was limited not by threats, but by creditor approval. Infrastructure projects were evaluated through the lens of debt service, not development. The Ottoman Empire was still fighting to survive in a hostile world, but now it had to do so with its hands partially tied. The deeper tragedy was that this loss of control came at the worst possible moment. The late 19th century was an era of intense global competition. Industrial powers were expanding, armies were modernizing, infrastructure was becoming decisive. The Ottomans needed flexibility. They had none. Every decision carried financial consequences. Every reform required external approval. The empire could not move quickly because it did not fully own its own revenue. Debt had transformed from a tool into a cage. Inside the imperial bureaucracy, resentment grew. Officials understood the implications clearly. The empire was no longer a full participant in the international system. It was being managed. Yet there was no alternative. Refusing the arrangement would have meant economic isolation, possible military intervention, and the acceleration of collapse. Accepting it preserved the state in name, if not in substance. This was the logic of survival. The Ottoman Empire had entered a phase where existence mattered more than independence. As years passed, the debt administration became more efficient, collections increased, creditors were reassured, European confidence returned, but it was no longer confidence in the Ottoman state, it was confidence in the system controlling it. The empire stabilized financially, but only because it no longer controlled its own finances. This paradox defined the final decades of Ottoman rule. The state appeared more orderly, budgets became predictable, revenues were accounted for. But political authority weakened further. The population increasingly viewed the government as an intermediary rather than a sovereign power. Foreign influence expanded quietly. Economic leverage translated into political pressure. Decisions that once would have been internal became international matters. The empire was not occupied, it was constrained. This distinction mattered to contemporaries, but less so in practice. Power had shifted without a single soldier marching into the capital. The Ottomans had learned a harsh lesson. In the modern world, sovereignty was no longer defended only with armies, it was defended with balance sheets, and the empire's balance sheet had failed. As the 20th century approached, the Ottoman state was still standing, but increasingly brittle. Nationalist movements grew, external pressures intensified, the empire faced new wars, new crises, and new demands. Each time, The same limitation applied. Resources were finite, control was partial. The final debt had not caused immediate collapse, it had ensured vulnerability. The empire could still fall to war, rebellion, or partition. But it would do so from a position of weakness it could not escape. That night of the signature had transformed decline into inevitability. The Ottomans had not signed away their empire. They had signed away their ability to save it, and that difference would define everything that followed. After the empire accepted supervision, collapse did not arrive immediately. That illusion was dangerous. The Ottoman state continued to function, but it no longer controlled its own direction. Decisions were made with caution, hesitation, and restraint. Not because leaders lacked vision, but because the margin for error was gone. Every reform had a price, every mobilization had a ceiling, every crisis was filtered through debt. The empire entered the 20th century already compromised. When wars came, they came to a state that could no longer mobilize freely. Military spending was constrained, logistics were fragile. Infrastructure lagged behind rivals. The Ottomans fought modern wars with limited tools, outdated systems, and borrowed time. Debt was no longer just a financial burden, it had become a strategic weakness. The empire lost territories not only because it was militarily weaker, but because it could not respond decisively. Resources were committed elsewhere. Revenues were pre-allocated. Flexibility was gone. As nationalism spread through the Balkans and beyond, the Ottoman response was inconsistent. Suppression required force, reform required money. Both were limited. The empire survived longer than many expected. That endurance often masks the truth. Survival is not the same as recovery. The Ottoman state endured, but it never regained autonomy. By the time the First World War arrived, the empire was already hollow. Entering the war was not a strategic gamble, it was an act of desperation. The leadership hoped that victory might reset the balance, erase debts, and restore sovereignty. Instead, it accelerated the end. War strained what little remained. Mobilization exposed administrative weaknesses. Logistics collapsed under pressure. The empire fought on multiple fronts with insufficient resources and dwindling support. When defeat came, it came to a state already exhausted. The armistice did not mark the end of the Ottoman Empire. It confirmed it. What followed was dismantling, not collapse. Treaties, occupations, negotiations. The final disassembly of a structure that had already lost its foundation decades earlier. And at the center of it all was that signature. The night the empire accepted its final debt was not dramatic. No flags were lowered, no sultan abdicated, no capital fell. But something essential was lost. Control, the ability to decide, the right to fail or succeed on its own terms. From that night onward, the empire existed under conditions it did not set and could not escape. This is the quiet truth of imperial decline. Empires do not always fall when they are defeated. They often fall when they agree to survive under terms they cannot control. Debt is not just money owed. It is influence. It is leverage. It is power transferred silently. The Ottoman Empire did not collapse because it borrowed. It collapsed because borrowing replaced reform, delay replaced resolution, and dependence replaced sovereignty. That night, the empire chose survival over independence. It was a rational choice, and it was fatal. Because once sovereignty is compromised, recovery becomes nearly impossible. The Ottomans continued to rule, but they no longer commanded. They administered decline. They managed erosion. They postponed an ending that had already been defined. History often portrays the fall of the Ottoman Empire as inevitable, as if centuries of decay led naturally to collapse. But inevitability is built from decisions, from moments when leaders choose the least disastrous option available. That night was one of those moments. The empire did not fall in a blaze of glory. It faded under supervision. It was not conquered by an army. It was constrained by agreements. And when the final collapse came, it felt less like an ending and more like the conclusion of a process that had begun long before. The Ottoman Empire lost its independence quietly. And without independence, empire was only a name. This is why that night matters, because it shows how power can be lost without violence, how sovereignty can be surrendered without invasion, how an empire can continue to exist long after it has stopped being free. The pen was not raised in anger, the signature was not forced at gunpoint, but once it was written, the future narrowed. That night, the Ottoman Empire did not fall. It accepted its end. And history moved forward, not with a crash, but with a clause.